In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and the regulations of the Lord. But they had no children, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. Once, when he was serving as a priest before God and his section was on duty, he was chosen by lot, Zechariah, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter into the sanctuary of the Lord and offer incense. Now, at the time of the incense offering, the whole assembly of the people was praying outside, and then there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayers have been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He must never drink wine or strong drink. Even before his birth, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit. He will turn many of the people of Israel towards the Lord their God, and with the spirit and the power of Elijah, he will go before him to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, and to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah said to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting on in years." The angel replied, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak, until the day these things occur." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondered at his delay in the sanctuary, and when he did come out, he could not speak to them, and they realized he had seen a vision in the sanctuary, and he kept motioning to them and remained unable to speak. And when the time of his service had ended, he went to his home. After those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she remained in seclusion. She said, "This is what the Lord has done to me when he looked favorably upon me and took away the disgrace I have endured amongst my people." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I'm reading the Harry Potter books to my son, and it's been a joy. I've only ever read them all through once, and I did that as an adult in a week. So I am rediscovering a lot that I had missed when I read it through, as my son discovers it for the first time. But yesterday, I posted about this on my Facebook. I read to him this chapter with a lot of trepidation because I knew that the death of an important character was coming. Do you know the Harry Potter story? Yeah. Do you care if I spoil it for you? Okay, so Cedric was about to die. And not just that, but after Cedric dies is this traumatic scene of violence and violation of Harry. At one point, he's even tied to a gravestone, and he's surrounded by these evil people who want him hurt and dead, and he thinks to himself, maybe someone will hear and come and help me. And no one hears, and no one comes to help him. He is 14, and he's hurting, and he's alone, facing these terrible and powerful enemies, and it's a heart-rending scene as a mother, and not just because you love these characters, it's heart-rending because it touches this place of pain we have all felt at some point in our lives. Loneliness when we suffer. It was the loneliness that I felt a year into being a single mother as I drove my son 3 hours north to a children's hospital and a doctor who would remove food that had been lodged in his esophagus for almost 18 hours. It was the loneliness my friend felt when she had to call the police on her soon-to-be ex-husband as she and her son huddled behind the locked doors of her home away from him. I imagine that it's the loneliness that undocumented little girl with cerebral palsy felt when ICE agents kept her from seeing her family. Suffering is made more bearable when we can share it with one another, when we know we're not alone in it, but suffering alone, now that makes us feel forgotten. And it makes us wonder where God could possibly be. Our scripture this morning is about Zechariah, an Advent player who doesn't get top billing. He's the father of John the Baptist, not of Jesus. He's an old priest. He's not a virgin mother. But there's a reason that the Gospel of Luke begins with his story and not Mary's. In no small way, Zechariah is actually a cipher, a figure who stands for and represents something bigger than himself. And in this case, Zechariah is Israel. An Israel that feels forgotten and unheard by God. Now remember, there's a gap in time between the end of what we call the Old Testament and the beginning of what we call the New. A gap in history of God's relationship with God's people. And between the last verses of Malachi and the beginning of the Gospels, there has been centuries of silence from God. There haven't been any prophets raised up to speak a word of the Lord to the people of God. There was a period of time when Israel ruled itself under Maccabean kings, but that time has passed, and Israel and its people have been under the fist of Rome for generations. Rebellions and revolutions rise up over and over again, only to be ground under the boots of Roman legions. Blood has spilled, and temples have been desecrated and sacked, and the people have cried out, and God has been silent. But despite that silence, Zechariah is said to be righteous and faithful, living according to the commandments, even though he and Elizabeth, his wife, were never blessed with a child. Now, considering how often the scriptures tell us a story about corrupt and evil priests, it's really nice to hear about one of the good guys, and Zechariah was one of them. And the story opens on a fairly significant part, a fairly significant day in Zechariah's life. He has finally drawn the lots to be offering prayer near the Holy of Holies. Some traditions tell us that the priests who did this had ropes tied around their midsections so that if they encountered the presence of God and were struck dead, people could pull them out without being at risk themselves. Some traditions say that this was a once-in-a-lifetime honor, and others say maybe just once a year, but whatever the specifics, we have lost in time. Zechariah is getting a chance to come face to face with God if God chooses to show up. But it seems that no matter who ends up lighting the incense for God, no one has heard from God in a long time, Zechariah included. He's an old man by the time we meet him. So there's been thousands of days, thousands of weeks of silence from God. Silence in the face of his childlessness, silence in the face of his people's subjugation, silence. But today was a different day. Zechariah is just doing his job, and God interrupts it. Then there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing at the right side of the altar of incense, and when Zechariah saw him, he was terrified. Everyone is always terrified when they meet angels. Fear overwhelmed him, but the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard." Your prayer has been heard is the first thing he hears. Your prayer has been heard. The story tells us Zechariah is afraid, but I imagine he's also pretty psyched. Finally, my prayer has been heard. I may be confused. God has heard? Was God not listening before all those other times when I was praying? And maybe even angry. Why now, Gabriel? Why is God only responding now, after decades of my prayer? Zechariah is Israel, and Israel is Zechariah, faithful for so long, lonely for so long, unheard for so long, and finally shocked when answered. But Zechariah is not just Israel, is he? Feel like Zechariah. Maybe you feel like Zechariah too. We've all carved out this time in our lives to be here, but we carry our lives with us. And those lives include not only the joys and the shiny parts we show to each other, but the sorrow of all the unanswered prayers, the loneliness of feeling like God's not listening. We've prayed and we've prayed and we've prayed for our parents who are sick, and our jobs which are hard, and our relationships which are fraught, and our countries which are torn, and our leaders who cater to corruption rather than their people, for rumors of war. We carry everything with us here. And it's not just us, right? Our neighbors are praying too for a country that would see them as human beings with inherent value rather than thugs or illegals or terrorists. So many women have been praying that when they tell the stories of their sexual harassment and assault, that they would finally be believed rather than blamed. We've carried prayers of despair, these women, enforced silence and lost jobs. Prayers that they would be reckoned and paid for, that they would no longer have to wonder about the justice that their faith told them they were supposed to have. So many prayers ascend every day, and many of them are laced with a lonely, despairing whisper, "Are you even listening to me, God? Have you forgotten us?" We show up to our lives, to our work, to our church, but we carry this sadness alongside our hope. That maybe today, we will finally be heard. Advent. It's not Christmas yet. It's Advent. The season that leads up to Christmas is a time of longing and waiting and hoping, even in the midst of that very real sadness. And we have this precious candle of hope because of the stories we read, like today, like Zechariah, that after decades he's finally heard, like Mary's, that after justice has been denied so long, it's going to be coming on its way. Stories like Elizabeth, that after a lifetime of shame, she will be accepted. Stories like the shepherds, that after being outsiders, God has included them. Advent is a time of anticipation that our loneliness ends and our suffering is witnessed, and that there will be and is truly a beautiful possibility of intercession, of healing. And that's why maybe your pastors get on you a little bit when they see you lose yourself in the Christmas that's defined by tinsel and colored lights and hot cocoa and bad cartoon movies on TV. I like those things too, guys. I like bright and happy stories, but these do not have the answer to the cry that echoes in our souls to be seen and to be heard by God. Our world is still full of people who dwell in their own personal exiles, their own unwitnessed pain, and they need less stories made up by Coca-Cola about a guy named Santa Claus, and they need more stories about Zechariah. They need to hear about the time when a people longed for generations for God to meet them, and then God finally did. They need to hear the story of a man of God who never expected to meet God and then was told, "Don't be afraid, God has heard you." In this season, we are messengers of God. Though we do not receive wings for our duties, we can be the ones who meet the discouraged and the despairing and the forgotten and the outsider and the fearful and the marginalized and the powerless and those who are barely clinging to hope and say, "Do not be afraid, God has heard you." I hope that amongst all the other busyness of this season in these 4 weeks, that you will keep your eyes and your ears and your hearts open to the people in your life who are like Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary and Joseph and shepherds and wise men. I will hope that you notice the ones who've been praying without ceasing, even though they've received no good answers. And I hope that you will consider the possibility that in Advent, you are an answer to prayer, a messenger sent by God to let someone know that they are not alone, that they are heard, and that God is on the way. My prayer is that this Advent season will help to turn you from an inward focus to an outward one, to your neighbor, so that at least in our suffering we would know we are not alone. May we be the first ones ready and willing to say the words that angels once said, "Do not be afraid, world. The Lord has heard you."